Hi everybody, this video will demonstrate how to collect and track when a target is hit in a first-person shooter point of game, and also display that collected target in the UI. So we'll create a UI element where the player can see how many targets they have hit. So I already have targets set up, where if I hit each one, they'll do different things. Like that one spins, this one falls down, I have one that moves and falls down. I have some physics ones, then I have some spinning ones in a different way. Okay. So what I want to set up is a option to where it's going to collect how many targets I hit no matter what kind of target it is, and then display that on the UI. So we're going to start by going to our character blueprint, and you can look up some of the previous videos I've created on setting up the character, setting up the targets, setting up projectiles, but this video will focus on tracking and displaying interactions in the UI. So in our character blueprint, we're going to create a new variable that we're going to call it targets collected. So over here on the left, we're going to click new variable. Let's go ahead and title it targets collected. And I'm going to change the type to integer because I want it to count in increasing whole numbers. So integer, and that's all I'm doing to begin with. Let's compile and save with the character. Drag this down a little bit. I'm going to go to one of my individual targets. So here's my BP target small, and open that up. And the first thing I need to do is cast out to the player. Casting is an option to look outward of this blueprint to other blueprints, and we're going to cast out to the player and find that targets collected variable from the player in this target blueprint. So if I go to event begin play, I'm going to drag out and choose cast to BP player. There you go. I titled my character BP player. Alright. I need to drag out from object to cast, from cast to BP player, and find get player character. There you go. And I'm going to promote this value to a variable. So if I right click on the as BP player, I'm going to right click and choose promote to variable, and we'll just simply title this one player. That will create a local variable in this blueprint for our blueprint character, or BP player. Alright, make this a little easier organized. Okay, so now here is my setup for the interaction to collide with the target on begin overlap of a box collider. Right there. It's going to cast to look to see if one of my projectiles, I have a ball and a rock projectile, is hitting it, and if so, then it's going to play an animation, and then that's going to set the relative rotation, which makes it fall down. That delays the motion for a second, or waits 1 second, and then spawns an explosion particle system, and then destroys this target actor. Okay, so that's how this target is set up. And what I want to do is, after I look to see if a projectile is hitting this target, I want to come in here, and I'm just going to move these over to the right more. In between the target casting and the timeline, and I cast the same way here with a projectile as I did up here with the player character. Right click, cast to. I want to get a reference of my player, so let's get our player variable that we created, and that gets a reference, so get player, to my player character blueprint. So I'm going to drag it down here, and from that I need to get my targets collected. So let's drag out from player, targets collected, and get targets collected. I have to move these over a little more. There we go. So get targets collected. Out from get targets collected, I'm going to drag out and hit the plus symbol. I want to do an integer plus an integer. There we go. And I'm going to leave it as default. So basically I want to get the targets collected, and when this target is hit, I want to add 1 to my targets collected value. So next thing I want to do is create a set targets collected. I need to increase that value, so let's drag off from the plus, and we'll choose set targets collected. We can turn off context sensitive, and that way that shows me where this is at and it's connected to my BP player. Set targets collected. I'm going to drag this up here like that. Alright, actually let's move this back here so I want it to be back there, and then this stuff can be down here. Here we go. And then now I'm going to replace my connection. So the cast a BP projectile ball is going to go into the set, and cast BP projectile rock is going to go into my set. And then my set is going to go over here to my play of the timeline to continue the motion and actions of my target. So that'll work. We can debug this and test this out if we want to, and we can drag out and say from set print string. That adds a print string in here, which is the debug to the console to tell us as development wise what we're going to happen. So you hit a target. There you go. And we can compile and save. Oh, let's see what's going on here. Invalid target. Okay, so we also need, let's copy our player variable over here. So we need our player variable, and that needs to go into the target of our set collected. There you go. So it told me it has an invalid target. This is a variable of our player blueprint, so we need the reference to the player blueprint again. Compile, save. There you go. So that will add 1 to our targets collected variable every time this type of target gets hit. And it also display a message that says you hit a target. Let's go play. So that's this target over here. So we're going to come over here and shoot that one, and it says you hit the target. I only have 1 of those in my scene, so we'll play again of this type of target. There you go. You hit a target. There you go. You hit a target. All right. So that tells us that we hit that target successfully. All right. Now we can go back and do the same thing for our other targets. So if you have the variations of targets, we can open up our target again, and we can repeat these commands in the other targets. So I'm going to pause the video and go do that for all the rest of my targets. I'll come back and I'll show you their setup in a minute. Okay, so I have it set up so that all targets can be hit. This is my physics target, that when it gets hit, it flies off. I've done the same thing. I've added it after the casting, but before whatever happens next to the physics target, and I have a small spin one, and I'm doing the same thing, adding the targets collected value set after the projectile, and I have a medium and tall one, and I'm doing the same thing. One thing I did want to mention is there could be some issues with overlapping, so we can actually change the type of let's see this. Let me remove some of this stuff out. Let's do this a small spin. And put it back to what it was. So on begin overlap. So the spin one can have some issues. Depending on kind of what motion's going on. See how that last one, it says it hit it twice there. So we could have some issues with on overlap of how it's spinning. That middle one now said it hit it twice. Okay, so what we can actually do is change our option. Instead of on begin overlap, we can remove that out and pull in our box collider as, if I right click, say on hit, add on component hit. We're going to do 2 things here. We're going to add the on hit instead of on overlap. We need to go to that box collider object and change the collision preset to block all dynamic. Then the other thing is, after it's hit, but before I display the text, I can come in here and say, let's see, set, let's see, what's it? Collision enabled, set collision enabled for the box, and then turn that collision off. And that will reduce out as many opportunities as it can to not have secondary hits. So basically, to begin with, we're going to replace the overlaps with on component hits, and then before we print the string, we're going to set in collision enabled to off. Okay, we could also do this before the set as well. So actually, we got to connect our actors up here to the other of our casting. Okay, so that way when we shoot, we can go test this out again. That should reduce out as much as it can of secondary hits. Okay, now it still might hit more than once, but that reduces it out drastically. So now we're ready to set up the UI element. So we got our value that's tracking how many targets are hit, and we're going to set up our UI element that now will display that back to the player. So in my content folder, I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new folder. We're going to title this one UI. And we're going to put all of our UI elements in this UI folder. The first thing I'm going to create is called a HUD, a heads up user display. And we're going to go to blueprint class, and we're going to open up the all classes and type in HUD. And we're going to title this one HUD FPS because this is a first person shooter. Alright, so we're going to create a HUD, and then we're going to display the UI in the HUD. Before we do anything else, we're going to go to the content folder where we put our game mode, open up our game mode, and change our default HUD class to HUD FPS that we just created. Let's compile and save that. We don't need any of that anymore. And then back in our UI folder, we're going to come back to our HUD in a minute. We're going to create individual UI elements. UI elements in Unreal are called widgets. So if I go to user interface widget blueprint, I'm going to type this out as W for widget underscore, and we'll call this one targets collected. Double click that. This is the UI window, and this is visually what will show up on the viewport when we're playing. So we're going to first come over here in the palette and type horizontal and drag in a horizontal box on top of the word canvas panel. And it puts it up here in the top right corner with the little anchor point. To begin with, I'm going to click on the anchor points and the details. I'm going to hold down Shift and place this where I want to. So we're going to put this in the bottom right. So I'm going to hold down Shift, and we're going to move the anchor point for this horizontal box to the bottom right of our viewport. Then that keeps the box itself at the top left. Now I can type in 0 and 0 for position X and Y, and it moves the box down to the anchor point. Now I want to inset this a little bit so the text isn't right up on the border. So we're going to type in -40 by -40, and that will inset it 40 units inside from the anchor point on both X and Y. I'm going to drag out my scale X and Y because I want my text to be a lot larger, just to give it some room. Okay, we'll scale it back down later. And then now I'm going to add a text box. So if I drag in just the text one by itself underneath the horizontal box, it's going to snap that into the text box, or the horizontal box that I already had. Let's go ahead and just give this a name. We're going to say let's see, targets collected, colon, and space. So that way I have a space in between what my next text box is going to be, which is going to be the number of my targets collected. I'm going to come down here and increase my size of my text to 48. And then now I can go back up to my horizontal box and adjust my vertical height and adjust my size X horizontally. I'm going to leave some room because I need another box in there, which is going to be for the value. So the next thing I'm going to do is add another text box to the horizontal box, and that will snap it to the right of that. I'll select that text box. I'm just going to type in a temporary value of 100. I don't think I'll have more than 3 digits necessary for however many targets I'm going to collect. So if you have 1,000 targets or 100 targets or 10 targets, then we would do 1,100 or 10. So I know I'm not going to have more than 999 targets. That's why I'm using the value of 100. We're going to change the text size to 100 again. And let's just go back to our horizontal box and make our adjustment here. Here we go. Alright, so that's what the UI is going to display. Targets collected, and right now a default value of 100. It's a good time to talk about fonts. So if I go select the targets collected font, there's a font family, and this is the specific font we're using. There's only one in by default. That's the Roboto one. And we can also change like the color of it if we wanted to. So maybe it's a slight pink color. Do the same thing for our value as well. But we don't have a lot of variety. Well, it's pretty easy to import in fonts. If I search for my control panel on a Windows computer, and then in the control panel I'm going to search for fonts. If you have fonts locally installed on your computer, we can drag them into Unreal to create a font asset. So to do that, first I'm going to go back into Unreal, go to my content folder and create a new folder called fonts. Open up that fonts folder, and then from the fonts folder of the control panel I'm going to go find a font that I might want to use. So maybe we'll do Gil Sans, drag a couple in here, and in Unreal it's going to say, do you want to create a font asset? Yep. Yes, to do. Maybe I had two selected. Maybe not. Maybe it's just two different fonts from in here. We can drag another one. Well, let's do that one. Move this out of the way so I can drag it in here easily. There we go. So yes. Alright, so you can add as many fonts as you might want in here. We'll do one more. How about this terminal one? Alright, so that one has an unknown extension, so we won't do that one. Didn't like that one. Let's do this one. Let's try that one. There we go. Alright, so basically we drag our fonts in, and we don't need our control panel anymore. And then now back in our UI widget for targets collected, we can select a font or a text box and then add a different font to this. Maybe we'll do that Gil Sans, or a different Gil Sans, Snap, and then this other kind of script font. I'm just going to put it back to Gil Sans because it's easier to read for UI. We always want to make sure we're choosing a font that is legible. There we go. Alright, we'll compile and save. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is replace this value for 100 with our targets collected integer that we brought over from our player character. And let's just maximize our widget here. And to do that, we need to use the graph. So here's our designer. That's what we've been looking at, the viewport. And then if I go over to graph, I'm going to drag out from construct, event construct, so this is the middle one, and I want to choose cast to BP player. We'll do the same things we did with the other blueprints. I'm going to drag out from object and choose get player character, and we're going to promote that to a variable. I'm going to call that variable just player again. Here we go. Alright, so basically we need to get a reference to our player, which also has the targets collected variable. So we're going to compile and save. We'll go back to the designer. Now, we're going to select our text box for the value of 100, and in the content, in the details panel, there's a bind option. So bind means we're going to look outside and look for a specific attribute, or in this case a variable, to drive what this text looks like. So instead of the value 100, it's going to be 0 by default, and then as I click and hit targets, it's going to add 1 to that. So instead of 100, it's going to display my targets collected. So if I choose bind to properties player, and here's targets collected, that's all I need to do. Let's do compile and save. So that's our setup for the widget. Now we need to go into the HUD and go into the event graph, and on event begin play, when the game starts playing, we want to drag out and choose create widget. There we go. And I'm going to choose my widget, so class, I'm going to change that to W targets collected, and then I want to add this to the viewport. So we'll do add to viewport. There you go. And then I'm going to connect my return value of the widget to the target of the viewport. Alright, let's compile and save. So now when I play my game, targets collected shows up over here. Starts off with 0. If I come over here and shoot a target, there you go, targets collected 1, targets collected 2, 3, 4, 5. So every target it's going to collect and add to my UI. So that's it. That wraps up creating a variable that tracks a target being hit, and then adding that to a UI element that will display that how many targets are hit back to the player. All right, that wraps up this video on UI and tracking items.